Imagine a battlefield. The year is 1526. Two empires are about to collide on a muddy plain in northern India. One side has war elephants. The other has cannons. Both sides have swords. But one group of warriors, a small, almost forgotten contingent, carries something different. Something that doesn't fit neatly into the history books. Something that was never glamorized in Hollywood, never romanticized in fantasy novels, never turned into a myth. And yet, this weapon helped shape empires. It slaughtered cavalry. It survived civilizations that rose and fell around it. And almost no one talks about it. This is the story of the Falchion, and why history buried one of its most lethal creations. Say the word sword to most people, and their minds go somewhere specific. The Japanese katana, sleek, deadly, wrapped in centuries of samurai mystique. The European longsword, noble, elegant, the blade of kings and crusaders, maybe Excalibur, maybe Sting, maybe whatever Aragorn carried, but the Falchion, silence. Even history nerds stumble over this one. And that's the problem, because the Falchion isn't pretty in the way we've been trained to see swords as pretty. It doesn't have the romance of the katana or the nobility of the longsword. It looks honestly a little brutish, a little utilitarian, almost agricultural, which is exactly why it was so terrifying. We've been taught to think of great weapons as elegant, but the best weapons in history were never about elegance. They were about what they could do to a human body, and what the Falchion could do was horrifying. The Falchion is one of the most misunderstood blades in the entire history of warfare, and part of that misunderstanding starts with where it came from. Most historians trace its earliest cousins to the single-edged knives of ancient Greece, the kopis, the machaira, weapons designed not for thrusting, not for dueling, but for hacking, for devastating power delivered in a single stroke. That design logic survived. It traveled. It mutated across centuries and continents. By the early medieval period, something recognizable as a falchion starts appearing across Western Europe. From England to France to the Italian city-states, these blades were single-edged, thick-backed, heavy near the tip, designed to deliver blunt, bone-crushing force with a cutting edge, and the people who used them weren't always knights. That's the real origin story of the Falcon. It wasn't born in royal armories. It wasn't commissioned by noblemen who wanted something beautiful to hang above their fireplaces. It was the weapon of the man in the mud, the foot soldier, the mercenary. The man who couldn't afford a longsword, couldn't train for a decade in the art of swordsmanship, and needed something that would end a fight fast. But here's where it gets interesting, because the falchion didn't stay with the common soldier. As the medieval period matured, it started appearing in the hands of knights, in royal paintings, in effigy sculptures carved to honor the nobility. Wait, why would a powerful knight, a man who could afford anything, who had trained his entire life, choose the peasant's weapon? That question has puzzled historians for centuries, and the answer tells us everything about what this blade could actually do. Here's the physics lesson no one taught you in school. A blade's cutting power isn't just about sharpness, it's about where the weight lives. The longsword, balanced near the hilt, precise, fast, excellent for thrusting between armor gaps. A duelist's weapon, a trained warrior's weapon. The falchion, weighted toward the tip. Heavy, asymmetrical, monstrous. That tip-heavy design meant that when a falchion connected, it didn't just cut. It transferred momentum like a meat cleaver, even through chainmail, even through early plate armor. The shock alone could break bones without ever penetrating the steel. And against unarmored targets, the falchion was catastrophic. Medieval chronicles, the accounts of monks and clerks who faithfully wrote down what soldiers reported from the field, describe falchion wounds in terms that make clear this was not a clean weapon. It wasn't about precision, it was about destruction. But the falchion had another advantage that military historians almost never mention. It was easier to make. A longsword requires a symmetrical, double-edged blade balanced perfectly along its entire length. That's a master craftsman's project. Expensive, time-consuming, reserved for men who could pay for it. A falchion, single-edged. The back of the blade just needs to hold. The geometry is forgiving. You could arm an army with falchions far faster and far cheaper than with longswords. And in an era when wars were won by fielding thousands of men quickly, That mattered enormously, but cheapness wasn't the only reason knights started reaching for them. There was something else, something almost counterintuitive. The falchion was easier to fight with, not easier to master, easier to fight with. A soldier with 6 months of training could be genuinely dangerous with a falchion. That same soldier with a longsword, still dangerous, but less so. The technique is harder, the learning curve is steeper, the margin for error is narrower. The falchion was a force multiplier for average soldiers, and that, perhaps more than anything else, explains why it terrified the people who faced it. Let's talk about the blade in action. The Crusades. European crusaders encountered Saracen warriors using curved, single-edged blades, relatives of the falchion design going back centuries. The crusaders didn't dismiss these weapons. They studied them, adopted their logic. When they returned home, their preferences had shifted. The Third Crusade. 1191, the Battle of Arsuf. Richard III of England leads a force that includes soldiers armed with heavy chopping blades cutting through Saladin's light cavalry in desperate close-quarters fighting. The falchion's geometry was designed for exactly this, defeating mounted opponents from the ground, targeting horses' legs, breaking formations from the inside. Then there's the 100 Years' War. 1415. Agincourt. The English longbowmen are famous. That story gets told again and again. But the men-at-arms who waded into the melee afterward, many of them carried falchions. The muddy, desperate, brutal close-quarters fighting of Agincourt was exactly the environment where a tip-heavy chopper outperformed a precision blade. You didn't need finesse when bodies were piled so high, men couldn't even swing freely. You needed power, shock, one stroke. And in England, there was a specific variant, the cusped falchion, that became something of a cultural institution. 2 examples survive to this day. The Conyers falchion, held at Durham Cathedral, is one of the oldest surviving swords in England. It dates to the 13th century. It was used in a feudal ceremony for centuries, presented to each new Bishop of Durham by the Conyers family as a formal symbol of their oath of military service. A legal document, written in steel. That's not a peasant's weapon. That's a weapon tied to power, to ritual, to identity. So why does almost no one talk about it? This is where the story gets a little uncomfortable. History isn't always written by winners. Sometimes, more often than we'd like to admit, it's written by romantics. The medieval and Renaissance periods saw the rise of a chivalric ideal, the knight as noble warrior, his weapon as an extension of his virtue. And the weapon chosen to represent that ideal was the longsword, symmetrical, elegant, cross-shaped, like a crucifix held in battle, carried by men who believed God was watching. The falchion didn't fit that image. It was blunt where the longsword was refined, asymmetrical where the longsword was balanced. It looked like something you'd find in a butcher's shop, not a cathedral. And when the chroniclers and the artists and the court painters wanted to immortalize their patrons, to transform mortal men into legends, they didn't paint them with falchions. They painted them with longswords, with elegant blades that whispered of virtue and nobility and divine favor. The falchion got cropped out of the portrait. Then came the Renaissance, and martial arts began to be codified, written down in manuals, systematized into schools with named masters and formal techniques. The long sword received entire treatises dedicated to its use. Fiore de Liberi, Hans Talhofer, Joachim Meyer. The falchion? Mentioned. Occasionally depicted, never quite the focus. By the time the early modern period arrived and firearms began displacing swords entirely, the falchion was already fading from cultural memory. Undefended, unmythologized, left behind, it was too ugly to be romanticized, too common to be mythologized, too effective to be interesting. And that is how history buries things. Not with malice, not with conspiracy, with aesthetics. Let's be honest about something. The katana is extraordinary. Its forging process, folded steel, differential hardening, a clay coating applied before the final quench, is genuinely remarkable metallurgy refined over generations. It's beautiful. The culture around it is rich and sophisticated, and in the hands of a trained swordsman, it is devastatingly effective. But the katana was optimized for a very specific context: light armor, fast opponents, a culture of martial artistry where technique was celebrated as an end in itself. Put that katana against a European knight in full plate armor, and you have a problem. The longsword, meanwhile, is the most technically sophisticated blade in Western history. Half-swording techniques, grabbing your own blade to use the hilt as a bludgeoning weapon against armored opponents, show a level of tactical intelligence that genuinely surprises people when they first encounter it. But the longsword requires years of dedicated training to use well. The falchion requires weeks. And in the brutal arithmetic of medieval warfare, where kings needed to field armies of thousands, where peasants became soldiers overnight, where a battle could be won or lost before the professionals even arrived, weeks mattered infinitely more than years. The falchion was never the best sword for a master swordsman. It was the best sword for a war. Here's something remarkable. The falchion never actually died. You see it everywhere, once you know what to look for. The kukri carried by the Gurkhas, Nepal's legendary soldiers, whose reputation was so fearsome that the British colonial forces decided to recruit them rather than keep fighting them. It's a falchion. Single-edged, tip-heavy, devastatingly efficient as a chopping weapon. The machete used across Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia. It's a falchion. The design logic is identical. Weight forward, single edge. Maximum chopping force with minimum effort. The falchion didn't disappear. It just changed its name, changed its context, became a tool instead of a weapon, which is perhaps the most honest thing a blade can become. The longsword became a symbol. The katana became a legend. The falchion became useful. And maybe that's the truest form of immortality a weapon can achieve. Not to hang in a museum behind glass, not to appear in a film or a fantasy novel, but to be in someone's hand, right now, doing exactly what it was designed to do, from a medieval battlefield in 1200 to a field in Guatemala this morning. The design hasn't changed because it doesn't need to. That is what it means to be truly effective. We have a tendency, all of us, to celebrate the beautiful things, the elegant things, the things that photograph well and look good on a wall and make for clean, satisfying narratives. But the unglamorous things, the things that actually worked, that shaped the world without getting credit, that did the real labor of history while the pretty things got the paintings, those things carry a different kind of dignity. The falchion wasn't carried by kings in portraits. It was carried by the man standing next to the king, the man whose name we don't know, whose face was never painted, who woke up on the morning of a battle, cold, probably hungry, probably afraid, strapped a heavy tip-weighted single-edged blade to his hip, and walked forward into something terrible anyway. History forgot that man. History forgot his weapon. But history was built by both of them. The katana gets the documentaries. The longsword gets the reenactments. The Excaliburs and Orchrists and Valyrian steels get the fantasy empires and the Hollywood budgets and the merchandise. The falchion gets the fields, gets the mud, gets the real, unglamorous, necessary work of history. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the greatest compliment you can pay a weapon or a person is that they were too busy actually changing the world to stop and take credit for it. The most underrated sword in history wasn't underrated because it wasn't good enough. It was underrated because it was too real.